Hello, hello everyone. I'm Rajesh Gopakumar from the International Center for Theoretical Sciences of TIFR, and I welcome you today evening to our latest edition of KDK, the Curiosity During Quarantine. This is our current avatar of the Kaapi with Kuriosity, which we have been hosting jointly with the Nehru Planetarium of Bangalore. And in better times, we used to have it in person at the planetarium itself. But for the last year or so, now we have been having these online versions of the KDK. In some ways, that's been good because also a lot more people have been able to join in from other parts of Bangalore, other parts of India and the world. But we look forward nevertheless to coming back to the in-person gatherings. But given the current situation, we don't know when that's going to happen. I hope all of you are staying well and keeping safe. And it's a very critical time, as you know, and we should all take the best precautions that science tells us that we can do, including being vaccinated and taking all the keeping all the protocols of maintaining safe distances, etc. So this is all what we can do as citizens to help curb this terrible spread and this tragedy that's unfolding. Anyhow, I think even at such times, it's important for us to sort of think about the bigger questions, bigger picture. And I really am very happy that the outreach team at ICTS has invited Professor Parth Chauhan from Mohali to tell us today about something very important, how science can help us in understanding better our past. And this is a very it's a very important thing to bring very modern, advanced scientific methods to a subject like archaeology, and I'm sure we'll hear more on this from the speaker. But the KDK series tries to bring together, tries to bring speakers from a variety of disciplines and topics and communicate how science is multifaceted, and there are exciting directions, many of which are probably a little bit away from the public eye, like this one, but which are nevertheless very interesting, very challenging, and hopefully this will attract young people to science and give the general layperson a better appreciation of the role of science in many aspects of our life and our culture. So ICTS is a center of the TIFR, the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, and apart from our own in-house research in mathematics, theoretical physics, quantitative biology, and related topics. We also organize a number of programs, and of course, these have been online for the last year once again. But all the talks, the lectures, which are range from the populous level to quite advanced technical topics. You can find all of these on our YouTube channel, ICTS Talks, and all the previous episodes of Kaapi with Kuriosity are also archived there. So please spread the word amongst your friends. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can be on our outreach mailing list. So I look forward to a lot of participation in this. So once now, let me again thank Professor Chauhan for agreeing to do this online lecture with us. And I'll hand it over to Professor Rukmini De of ICTS to introduce the speaker.
Thank you, Rajesh. It's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Parth Chauhan, who is a faculty at ICTS Mohali. Professor Chauhan did his BA in anthropology in Rutgers University, MA in archaeology and ancient Indian history in Deccan University, Deccan College, and PhD at University of Sheffield in UK. He did his postdoctoral fellowship at Stone Age Institute in USA. He is currently heading the Narmada Basin Paleoanthropology Project and also collaborating with Government of Maharashtra in Konkan. He has also carried out field work in Yemen and Sudan. His students are doing doctoral research in UP, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Andaman and Nicobars. So welcome Professor Parth Chauhan and thank you for agreeing to talk today. He'll be talking about scientific approaches to understanding the past. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for inviting me to give this talk. It's an honor to be giving this talk at this institution. And my presentation today is about how we can use different sciences to understand our past. And I'm mostly focusing on human evolution and examples from archaeology in a general sense. Now, just before I get into the actual scientific methods, I would like to give everyone a very broad overview of the timeline I'm talking about, and also the specific evolutionary milestones that we have actually documented so far. So one thing I would like to highlight is that we use scientific methods in archaeology and also paleoanthropology to investigate different types of evidences. One is, of course, looking at known sites reported earlier. This is because a lot of sites have been found over the last few decades, sometimes even 100 years ago, but they have not been studied properly with new scientific methods available today. So we can go back to known sites and reinvestigate them to understand them better. And then, of course, we study newly discovered sites, as well as historical museum collections and related evidences. As you'll see in this presentation, archaeology is not just about human material culture or artifacts, but also a range of evidences that we look at, especially in paleoanthropology. And the difference between archaeology and paleoanthropology is basically time depth. Archaeology is a study of human culture and human material culture. And paleoanthropology is basically looking at human evolution from a multidisciplinary perspective, using various sciences, using various techniques and methods to get a more comprehensive or holistic picture on human evolution. And we use all of the scientific methods to not only advance our knowledge and progress further, but also to confront various pseudosciences that keep persisting at some levels. Now, if we're looking at human evolution in a nutshell, our timeline begins around 7 million years ago when we start becoming bipedal. And bipedalism, it actually gets triggered by various factors, including ecological change, behavior, social interactions, a need for tool use. Many different things come together. So from 7 million years onwards, based on current fossil evidence, we have been bipedal since then. But that doesn't mean that bipedalism was instant. It doesn't mean that it was as we know it today. It took on various forms. In the beginning, various species were bipedal only part of the time and not all the time. They were still living an arboreal way of life, or living in the trees. But gradually, over millions of years, climatic changes, behavior, everything came together and bipedalism progressed. Then we have the earliest stone tools known at 3.3 million years ago, and the earliest evidence of butchery or meat eating, which is 2.6 million years ago. And then the earliest fossil evidence of our genus, Homo, is about 2.8 million years old. And based on evidences in China, in Europe, in India, we definitely leave Africa at least 2.1 million years ago, probably maybe even 2.5 million years ago. Oldest known evidence of fire is 1.4 million. We have the beginning of Neanderthals that appear in Europe around 350,000 years ago. And interestingly, our species, Homo sapiens, also kind of evolves at the same time, but in Africa. At the moment, the earliest fossil evidence for Homo sapiens is in Africa. But after this time, the last 300,000 years, as Homo sapien populations start moving around Africa, as they start leaving Africa, the story becomes much more complicated, and that's where the sciences come in. We have multiple dispersals of Homo sapiens from Africa at different times in different directions. And of course, they reach different distances. The earliest evidences right now come from Europe, about 210,000 years old, and then in the Levant, 177,000 years old. But from 50,000 years onwards, our species is more or less across the entire old world. And about 20,000 years onwards, they're also across the new world. About 100,000 years ago, with the beginning of symbolic behavior, including the making of beads, gradually artwork, abstract art, and various other behaviors, such as long distance transport of raw materials. And then 30,000 years onwards, based on fossil evidence and genetic evidence, we are the only species existing. Before 30,000, our species overlaps with many others before they become extinct one by one. And then the last 10,000 years is the Holocene period. And 10,000 years ago, we have the transition from the end of the Paleolithic, the end of the Mesolithic, and the beginning of the Neolithic. So various lifestyles, adaptations, and cultures come together, some die out, and there's a major transition in behavior and adaptations. So the beginning of domestication, agriculture, pastoralism, living a sedentary lifestyle. So you can see a broad timeline in a very short manner. Of course, there's many, many milestones that I did not cover, and different regions have their own respective records. And not all of these evidences are found everywhere evenly. Some areas are missing fossils, some areas are missing stone tools, some areas preserve better DNA evidence. So there's a lot of different records globally. Now, the main question we're trying to understand in human evolution in our past, or archaeology, is what were the timings and factors of biological, behavioral, and technological transitions? Exactly what led to these changes? Why did some cultures or some species change while others did not? Why did some technologies get innovated while others persisted for a long time? Which species became extinct and which did not, and why? What were the specific dispersal routes taken and avoided over time? And this is not just for dispersal routes out of Africa, but also dispersal routes across Europe, across Asia, India, within Australia as well. So when are they getting to islands, for example? There's a lot of things we don't know geographically. Another question is, what were the environmental contexts for various hominin occupations and adaptations? How did they adapt to changes in landscapes, to changes in ecology, changes in climate, fauna, flora, and of course, social interactions between species? For example, once various species left Africa very early and became established, and then Homo sapiens leaves Africa, what were those interactions like? In some places, we know that they interbred, but in other places, we don't know if they interbred, if they avoided each other, if there was population replacements, or did some of these earlier populations become extinct before the arrival of Homo sapiens? And of course, one of the big questions we're trying to answer is, which animal species became extinct because of human impact? It could be overhunting or indirect exploitation, for example. There's many factors that we consider, but we don't know the weight of each factor. It could be climatic patterns, it could be changes in ecology, it could be human impact, variability across the landscape. Now, one of the biggest scientific aspects that we apply in archaeology is dating. In archaeology, dating is everything. Why I say this is because unless we know the timing of events, we can't put together all the pieces of the puzzle. We need to understand when things happened. When did technology change? When did species change? How old is a specific fossil? How old is a specific site? When we have accurate dates or numbers on these estimates, we can actually reconstruct more accurately the timing, but also factors for variation in timing. Some places, the technologies or the species evolve very fast. In other places, it persisted for a long time. In fact, some technologies continued for over 1 million years without any change. Some technologies evolve only within a few thousand years. So what are the factors behind all these things? So without dates, we cannot say much. And I'll just give you a very broad introduction in different dating methods and of course the limitations. So we have two groups of dating methods. We have absolute dating methods, which we use to get exact numbers, and other is relative dating method. This only tells you if something is older or younger than a specific age. Now, various methods are used in various contexts, but not all of them are always possible. Specific conditions are required to apply these methods. Now, some examples of relative dating methods are a law of superposition, or looking at different layers of the earth, of the sediments, biochronology, looking at ages of different fossils, for example, paleomagnetic dating, seriation or typology of artifacts, and of course, fluorine dating, which you can use to tell high amounts or low amounts of fluorine, depending on the depth of the specimen, whether it's very deeply buried or very young and very shallow buried, for example. So it depends on what the age is, what the geological history of these specimens are. Sometimes what happens is there's disturbance of the site, and these methods are not always applicable. If the site is disturbed, then we have to find other ways to date the sites or date the artifacts. In most cases in archaeology and paleoanthropology, the dating of the specimens is done indirectly. We never date the artifacts directly, or we never date the fossils directly. There's very few methods that allow that. And the methods that we do use are not always applicable. And all of these dating methods have limitations as well. Here's showing you the law of superposition, where you have different layers, geological layers. And if a site is not disturbed from the beginning, then we can say that the oldest layers are in the bottom and the youngest layers are on top. So whatever is found within these layers or strata, we can say that artifacts from the bottom are older and artifacts from top are younger. And then gradually, because of the strata, we can build a sequence based on morphology, based on the position in the section or the stratigraphy, and then use seriation or typology to see change in artifacts over time. Another example is paleomagnetic dating. Again, we need a specific condition to be met to use this method. We need a sequence of strata that go back millions of years and actually preserve evidence of the different polarity change in the past, whether it was a reverse polarity or a normal polarity, because today the compass points north, but in the past, and many times, the compass would have pointed south. So the north, the magnetic north, it fluctuated several times, in fact, many times over millions of years. And this phenomenon we can actually associate with the archaeology or fossils to understand exactly the age of those evidences. Depending on which layer they are found, and depending on the polarity, whether it's reversed polarity or normal polarity of that layer in the entire sequence, we can pinpoint the age. But we cannot use this method on a very short or small section. We need lengthy sedimentary sequences to actually put together all the normal and reversed polarity events. And then we have a range of absolute dating methods. I'm just going to cover some broad examples. I'm not going to talk about each and every method. Now we have dendrochronology, looking at tree rings. When you cut a tree, every year that it grows, there's a ring that forms, or bark, and that ring is visible when you cut the tree. So you can count the rings, get an age for the tree. You can also look at things like drought, that'll be visible in the tree rings, or a very wet season, for example. So this we can also use for radiocarbon dating. Any organic material we can use for radiocarbon dating or AMS dating. for example, charcoal, bone, wood, shell, eggshell, plant material. Then we have potassium argon dating based only on volcanic ash. Then we have luminescence dating, which is very popular for certain time periods. We look at quartz and feldspar that are buried in the sediments. We can also use pottery to use luminescence for dating pottery, depending on the way it was fired, the way it was made. And of course, all of these materials have to come from undisturbed context region. Then we have tephrochronology, which is looking at ash and finding out which layers of ash correlate with other layers on the landscape. Because in specific areas where there's volcanoes, we have a lot of regular eruptions and blankets of ashes deposited on the landscape. So eventually what happens is on a large landscape, when you have one eruption, that layer of ash becomes a stratigraphic or chronological marker. And we use that marker to build up the entire sedimentary sequence and get absolute ages and then relate all of the fossils and artifacts to that number. Then we have electron spin resonance. This is done on shell or fossil teeth or calcrete, which is calcium carbonate nodules. Then we have uranium series dating on stalagmites and stalactites, those rocky formations in the caves. Also cosmogenic nuclide dating on rocks and rock surfaces. So this is just some examples of different dating methods. Now, some of them are more useful for older sites, and some of them are more useful for younger sites. It also depends on what you have preserved at the site. Not all sites have organic material preserved. For example, radiocarbon dating and AMS dating, there's a limit of about 50,000, 60,000 years. Anything older than that, we cannot use radiocarbon. Now, if you have a site where we have stone tools and volcanic ash and animal fossils, we can use multiple methods. When possible, and if there is funding, if there's expertise available, if there's labs available, we try to combine different dating methods to get the most accurate age. And sometimes it's possible that the ages don't match. Then we have to explain why they don't match. It's not necessary that we're going to get a perfect age all the time. It's also possible that we use one method on the same samples over time and get different results. So there's also problems of inconsistency. That can be a problem with contamination of the samples. It can be a problem with the methodology of the lab, or it can be that the samples that we collected are mixed and come from different time periods. So there's many factors that affect dating methods. I just want to cover these various examples to show you that dating is very important. And without absolute ages, we cannot really make a full story at any site. Now, besides dating, another important aspect, scientific aspect that we apply in paleoanthropology and archaeology is environmental reconstructions. We try to understand the past climate, the past vegetation, the past ecology, the animal life, and of course, if possible, the past landform evolution or landscapes and topography. Now, putting all those together, we try to understand what habitat the hominids were living in or the animals were living in. What were they adapted to? Was it a very wet zone? Was it a very dry zone? Was it a lake environment, a river environment? Or were they adapted to springs? A range of landscapes existed in the past. Now, we can use modern landscapes. For example, the Serengeti Plains in Africa. We can use that as an analogy to interpret past evidences. But all of the sites that we're looking at today do not resemble what they used to be. They've changed over time. Today, what we see on the landscape is grasslands, but in the past, it could have been a very thick and humid forest. So a lot of climatic changes have occurred over millions of years. We need to reconstruct these events over time. And of course, there's other events that come into play. There could have been flash floods on the landscape. There could have been extensive forest fires in the landscape. There could have been extensive earthquakes, volcanic events. So all of this environmental change or instability actually facilitated human evolution and various milestones, including behavior including technology, biological change, and interactions with fauna, flora, and climate. And these are the various proxies we use to understand ancient environments. For example, we would collect sediments using borehole. We can collect sediments from a cave or a coral reef, even animal fossils. There's various sources of evidences. We can even look at lake sediments. At the bottom of the lake, we can take a core of those sediments and reconstruct the ancient landscape around the lake based on pollen evidence of ancient plants. We can tell what kind of vegetation was near the lake, for example. And if we're finding animal fossils, we can build up a kind of ecological community based on animal fossils, whether it was fully forested or partly forested and partly grasslands, because different types of animals live in different habitats. Like zebras and giraffes live in grasslands, but certain elephant species and deer species live in forest environments. So ultimately what we're trying to do is link environment and even evolution by using all of these methods. Even things like historical records for younger time periods, insect records, because insects, and even small mammals, for example, they speciate very fast. So based on the stratigraphy, we can look at the different species and the rate of biological change and get an understanding of climatic change that is correlating with that. And then looking at wind-borne sediments like loess, looking at plant macrofossils, and then looking at the landscape level and trying to model the ancient topography. So all of these things that we do, we try to put together, and multiple scientists are usually involved. So most of the investigations today at very well-preserved sites are multidisciplinary in nature. In decades ago, in the earlier days, we had archaeologists working on their own, or geologists working on their own. But today now, we have a very specialized discipline called geoarchaeology, which actually takes things further and integrates all of these methods. So you would carry out stable isotopes on the fossil teeth, combine it with pollen data, combine it with animal fossil data to get a more accurate reconstruction of the past habitat. It's not always possible to rely on one method. For example, what if you have a disturbed site? What if animal fossils from a forest environment and animal fossils from a grassland environment got mixed together because of geological processes? Then we cannot use that as a combined animal community. We would actually need to tease apart these evidences by looking at stable isotopes on the teeth, by looking at pollen data from different locations on the landscape, and of course, artifacts and other materials. Now, I want to give you an example of how we can relate archaeology to environment. Now, let's say that we have a specific technology, like these spear points. Now, over time, how would we understand factors of technological change? How would we pinpoint the reasons why these changes occur? If there was technological change, or even if there was no change, if there was technological stasis over time. Now, let's say that we have a specific ecology like grasslands, and associated with that, we have the fauna, like large mammals. Naturally, for large mammals, the humans would have hunted them with spears. So we find spear points on the landscape at this time period. But in the past, some climatic changes occurred that affected the vegetation, and that affected the fauna, and that affects the human technology. So as the large mammals decrease, because of changes in ecology and changes in vegetation, the number of points, spear points, also decrease. This will be based on long-term research, intensive research in one area, in different layers, very well dated sites. And I'm talking about a situation that is ideal. Not all areas have well-preserved records. I'm talking about a very theoretical level here. And then once the large mammals disappear and they're replaced by small mammals because of a forest environment, the technology required is different. You don't need large spear points to hunt small mammals. You would hunt them with bows and arrows, for example. Or you would hunt them with traps, snares, nets. So you would have a different technology completely. So this would, I'm just giving a very simplified version of how ecology and climate can affect technology over time. It's also possible that the fauna did not change, but the climate changed. The climate and vegetation changed, but the fauna did not change because they adapted. And then the spear points were found in all kinds of environments: grassland environment, forest environment, desert environment. And now we're trying to understand that, in fact, looking at technology, looking at the presence of humans, looking at climatic patterns, to see if humans impacted past faunal extinctions. So we have this paper recently published by Chauhan, and what they did is they looked at the timings of these different species in India that disappear. For example, we have wild cattle, we have hippopotamus, we have the wild horse, and 2 species of elephants, and the ostrich. These species were existing in the past in India, and soon after 50,000 years ago, they start disappearing. And by 10,000 years ago, they have all disappeared. So including ostriches. So what we're trying to understand is, what role did climate play in this, and what role do humans play in this? Was there overhunting by humans? Was there overexploitation of ostrich eggshells by humans? Because we do find evidences of ostrich eggshells in association with archaeological sites. So of course, they were probably targeting the eggs for food, but also they were targeting them for as water containers, for making beads. So if they were targeting them over a long time, they would affect the populations. Now, it's not necessary for human populations in the past to intensively hunt these animals for them to become extinct. There's also indirect implications involved. For example, as populations increased, and we know this from genetics, we know this from archaeology, and as they spread across the Indian subcontinent, there would be encroachment on different habitats. All of these species would eventually become ecologically marginalized, just like we saw today with the Asiatic lion. They used to be everywhere, but now they're only in Gujarat. Same thing with the rhino. They used to be everywhere, but now they're only found in Northeast India. So we have these various roles humans played in the past. We need to find out exactly the ratio that climate played and the ratio that humans played. In some places, it's possible that humans played no role at all. So we use all these methods combined with environmental reconstructions, the technological evidences from archaeology, and of course, human fossils if we find them, to put together a very comprehensive picture to see what happened in the past. A very important topic is the Toba eruption. A volcano erupted 74,000 years ago in Southeast Asia, and all of this ash is found in India, in the deep seas, and it's also reached Southern and Eastern Africa. So the big debate is exactly what impact did it have? Some scientists say that it had a major impact on human populations. Some scientists say that it had a very minimal impact on human populations. So one question is, how much did it affect ecology? Did it affect human populations indirectly? And did technology change? The main problem with this debate is a lack of sites, undisturbed sites, I would say, in association with archaeology. Artifacts are required to be found in the sections below the ash and above the ash to build a complete picture and get an idea of what's happening. But we have very few primary sites with archaeology, so we cannot really tell the picture. Only 2 sites have been excavated, Jwalapuram and Toba, in association with Toba ash. So we don't know the actual full picture across the subcontinent. More research is required from different environments. In fact, from 74,000-year-old sites in Thar Desert, similar sites in Maharashtra, Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh, Northeast India, across various environments, we need this data to get a more holistic picture. It's possible that the Toba eruption impacted populations variably across the subcontinent. Then we also use experimental archaeology. We reconstruct past lifestyles, sometimes entire structures, sometimes artifacts, and we utilize them to better understand them. Not just the efficiency of these artifacts or technologies, but also how much manpower did it take to make these things? How much time and effort did it take to make these things? How much raw material was used to make a specific object, like pottery, for example, or an iron spear, or hand axe. And then once we have these artifacts replicated, we often use them to understand, for example, their efficiency, their impact on certain materials, especially stone tools. We're trying to understand by using stone tools to settle some debates. For example, we use microscopy to understand the nature of marks on the bones. When you use a stone tool on a bone to cut the meat off, there's often contact between the stone tool and the bone. So it leaves cut marks, just like a knife leaves a cut mark on a bone today. So in the past, when the stones were used on these things, they left marks on the bones, which became fossilized. And ultimately, we're trying to understand by looking at archaeological evidence, which is fossilized bones with cut marks, then looking at experimental stone tool making and experimental butchery, and combining that with microscopy and 3D scanning to see if humans were hunting or whether they were scavenging. If they were scavenging, when did hunting start? Because we have these behaviors for getting meat, obtaining meat on the landscape. There's different patterns across the landscape. In some places, scavenging started very early, maybe around 2.6 million or 3 million years ago. And then around 1.8 million years ago, we have evidence of regular and active hunting with more complex stone technologies. So scientific methods can also help us address these debates. Another way we can use microscopy, especially Raman signatures, is to understand the pigments found in ancient art. These rock paintings from South Africa, they were actually analyzed, plus the modern pigment made by modern hunter-gatherers was also analyzed. And there was also experimental pigments created to compare all of these data sets together. And they found out that by making these pigments, replicating them, by comparing them with archaeological pigments, they found out that there's a range of materials used to make these paints or pigments. And they were combining these various materials with other materials to bind these pigments together. That's why a lot of these paintings you see in the caves, in the rock shelters, have survived for thousands of years. Now, a lot of these paintings, in fact, they're not as primitive as you think. They're pretty advanced. They're going back as far as 44,000 years old in Southeast Asia, in Europe. Most places we have not yet dated these paintings. And over time, if we get lucky with preservation and better techniques, we can probably push back the antiquity of rock painting, maybe 60,000 or 80,000 further back. Then we also look at specific archaeological evidences in a unique manner. In the past, we were not applying that many scientific methods. We would kind of destroy the artifact. We would put together a story and it would get published. There would be popular articles, for example. But now what we're trying to do is preserve these things. In many cases, it's not always possible to manipulate the object. For example, here we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, 2,000-year-old scrolls stored in a cave, in many caves, in fact, in the Near East. And now when they're found and exposed to air, they get easily destroyed. It's not easy to preserve them. It's not easy to open them up or unwrap them. So now we're using micro CT scanning to actually look at the composition of the ink and pick out what they wrote. So kind of X-ray of these scripts without opening the rolls. So there's a lot of these techniques which are actually non-destructive compared to, for example, other methods which actually take a sample from the specimen or sometimes destroy entire specimens to get the scientific information. Now, if you have ample amount of animal teeth, you can afford to destroy one for AMS dating. But if you have very few teeth or a fragment of a tooth, you cannot afford to destroy it, even though the date that you need, the age of that tooth you need is very important. So these kind of methods have also been applied to mummies. Without unwrapping the mummy, without disturbing its position, its integrity, and not just human mummies, but animal mummies as well. We can use X-rays to understand many things about them. We can find out the gender, we can find out the specific biological conditions, pathological conditions, the age of the individual. There's many, many things that we can do. And also figure out what the relationship is between these various individuals, morphologically, looking at stature, without opening these mummies. You can also use 3D scanning, for example. You can use laser scanning to reconstruct not only artifacts, but also structures, especially symmetrical objects like pottery. Most times, the artifacts we find in excavations or during surveys are often broken. And to reconstruct them, we use various techniques like 3D scanning to understand them better. And sometimes we just have a few fragments that we can virtually reconstruct the entire specimen as it was. The same thing goes with now sites, entire rooms, habitation rooms, entire structures, specific foundation walls. All of these things can be reconstructed based on the evidences that were found. A very exciting discovery last year from India, they actually studied pottery from a Harappan site in Kutch. What they found out is that they found evidence of dairy exploitation. They were consuming milk. Now, we knew this because we found cattle bones and buffalo bones for many decades at Harappan sites. But the fact that they were consuming milk was always hypothetical. It was theoretical. This is the first time a team was involved in actually scientifically proving by looking at the lipids in the residue preserved in the pottery to prove that they were actually consuming dairy products. So this shows that we can use scientific methods to our advantage if the artifacts are well preserved, if the site is well preserved, and if there's no contamination. Now, I'd like to just cover DNA through a few slides. Now, one very important aspect of DNA is not just trying to get our genetic information, not just trying to understand our medical past, but there's also other aspects of DNA now helping us reveal a very complicated story of human evolution. For example, there's a lot of bones in the human body which we cannot easily identify species. Sometimes if we have the skull, if we have the teeth or the jawbone, we can use that information to identify species. But if you have something like a finger bone on the top right, we cannot use that to identify species. So in this cave, Denisova Cave, they found this bone many years ago. And because of its preservation and the climatic condition in the region, it preserved DNA. And we found out that it actually belonged to a new unknown species called Denisovans. Now, the DNA did not match Homo sapiens, and the DNA did not match Neanderthals, which are both known to be in the region archaeologically. This is the first time that they actually used DNA to prove the presence of another species on the landscape. And later on, they found more fossils of the species in Asia as well. So sometimes what happens is we have the fossils, but no DNA preservation. Or sometimes we have modern DNA, but no ancient DNA. So we're trying to now just scratch the surface using DNA techniques. And it's getting more interesting because we're finding out these species, the Denisovans, were widespread, not just based on DNA, but based on fossils, based on archaeology, and protein. Some of these fossils don't preserve DNA, but they preserve proteins. And by identifying distinct individual proteins, we can identify a species. And sometimes, even if you have teeth or a mandible or even the cranium, it does not help in identifying species. Even though it's useful, sometimes there's morphological overlap between different species. So things like DNA and protein analysis actually pinpoint individual species despite morphological overlap. And it's getting even more interesting and more amazing. A few years ago, and also a few weeks ago, they reported from multiple sites the presence of hominins in these cave sites based only on sediments. No fossils were found. Just based on sediments, they found evidence of DNA preserved inside these caves. So the source is not known, where exactly this DNA came from. It could be from hair, it could be from feces, it could be from bone, it could be from anything. But the fact that they identified human DNA from sedimentary context of a cave without any fossils is amazing. And this actually showed us many things. It showed us about the population replacements of the Neanderthals, the genetic relationships of the older Neanderthals and the younger Neanderthals, and of course, radiation events of specific lineages coming into the region, living there for a certain amount of time, several generations, and then either moving on or getting replaced by incoming populations. So the genetics shows us a lot of information, not just about relationships between populations, but also population levels, about mutation rates, for example, about relationships with other regions, relationships with individual populations. So there's a lot of information we still have yet to learn if the sites are well preserved. And coming to India, the use of DNA recently has been made famous by the evidence from Rakhigarhi in Haryana. This Harappan site now is thought to be one of the biggest Harappan sites, and some say the biggest known Harappan site. 4,500 years old. They tested, I think, about 60 skeletons, and they were able to extract DNA from one female skeleton, and they found out that the genetics of that skeleton matches with today's populations. And it also shows that there's no major relationship with Central Asian populations. Those populations were actually separated for a long time, and the big debate in Harappan archaeology was, what is the relationship of the Harappans with surrounding regions, including West Asia, Central Asia, and parts of Northwest India and Pakistan. So this actually, for the first time, showed that there's a very deep indigenous history of these populations. It's not that people are continuously coming in and replacing them. So in relation to the Aryan debate, this proved that there's no relationship actually with the Aryan debate, and the Aryan issue is moot. So it makes sense that on the one hand, there is no mixture, there's indigenous history, but on the other hand, we should also be cautious about how we interpret this evidence. We should not use this evidence to generalize about the entire Harappan population. This genetic evidence from Rakhigarhi represents one individual from one site from one point in time. Now, let's say hypothetically, we get lucky and we get DNA evidence from Gujarat, from Punjab, from various places in Pakistan, from Rajasthan, many places across the entire Harappan domain. Then we will need to see the DNA evidence from across the landscape and across various time periods. Because within the Harappan time frame, there were various phases of Harappan occupation. And some sites in the Harappan domain are older, and some sites are younger. So we don't exactly know the population history or the geographic history of population movement across the Harappan domain. So one data point is not enough to interpret about the entire Harappan population, but it is a starting point, and it shows that there's a possibility of more skeletons with preserved DNA. Now, I would like to end my presentation just by highlighting that even though we have all these scientific methods, and science is progressing in the future with more and more better techniques, more technology, more refinement in the methods, some things in archaeology and in our past, we just will never know. For example, gender differences in behavior, like stone tools we're finding, or all the rock paintings. We won't know if they were being made by males, females, or both. We won't know about social taboos in certain cultures. Also about extinct populations. If you have a small culture emerging in one area and they last for several generations and then die out, and if there's no fossil evidence, if there's no genetic evidence, we'll never know about their existence. So we do have limitations in our subjects, and we do have limitations regardless of scientific methods available. Another thing is that there might be cases where we have well-preserved sites, but specific material items do not survive. We might have abundance evidence of butchery or fossilized bones, human fossils, structures, but no evidences of other materials, like artifacts made from wood or bone or ivory or antler, horns. There's many perishable materials that were being used in the past which have not survived, do not become preserved. So we just won't know how much they were using it. In fact, the reason we call it the Stone Age is because stone is the dominant artifact type that is happened to be preserved. But they were probably using wood extensively, antler, many things. And we also will not know about past languages that became extinct, that emerged at various places, that diversified, that spread geographically, and then died out. So these are just some examples of types of information that we'll just never know about, unfortunately. Another example is species. We have 5 different crania found at this site called Dmanisi. All of them are 1.8 million years old in Europe, but there's a debate whether they all represent one species or more than one species. The reason for this is because there's a lot of morphological variation. They're not all similar. Even though they come from one small site and they're all the same age, we don't know if they represent 2 species or 1 species. And we might never know, because we need more fossils, and fossils are very, very rare. So based on this one chance preservation, we have diversity in the population, we'll never know whether it represents more than 1 species or not. And the same goes for other regions as well. Science cannot help us always answer or identify a specific type of species because of the morphological overlap. We also won't know the purpose of rock paintings or the specific purpose of different symbolic behaviors. Why were they painting animals in the cave? Why were they painting human figures? Was it for showing some history of the region? Was it for storytelling? Was it for good luck before a hunt? Or was it for just decoration of their home? There's probably different purposes of different artwork across the prehistoric record. We cannot hypothesize or generalize about one single purpose. There must be multiple purposes within different cultures. But regardless of finding patterns from 3D scanning or statistical analysis or residue analysis, some things we just won't know. Especially when we have multiple cultures painting on top of each other on these surfaces. So we have a lot of overlaps. So a lot of these paintings, the oldest paintings are faded and the younger paintings are on top. So we don't know exactly what the purpose was. Maybe the purpose changed over time, over generations in one site, in one cave. And finally, I would like to end this presentation just to highlight my lab's research, which is using different scientific methods to answer different research questions in human evolution in archaeology. Our research includes surveys, excavations, scientific lab work at Mohali and other labs, documentation of sites, animal observation, replication, and utilization of stone tools. And our research actually is taking place various locations across India, including Rajasthan, Himachal Pradesh, Punjab, Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, and Maharashtra, and Andaman and Nicobar Islands. And my research in the past has taken place in Yemen and Sudan as well. And all of this work has been funded by various funding agencies, including Mohali. But I would like to highlight, also importantly, the nature of these different research topics, mostly being carried out by my PhD students and postdocs. And they include basically looking at primate archaeology or object manipulation and tool use by primates in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, looking at landscape patterns of human occupation, like for example, it could be microlithic sites, it could be Paleolithic sites, different types of sites on the landscape in central India, western India. And then some students are looking at rock paintings and the elemental composition of pigments. Some students are looking at the ages of sites, trying to date them using luminescence methods, paleomagnetic methods, also radiocarbon dating, ESR. And some students are looking at environmental reconstructions using geochemistry, stable isotope methods, looking at pollen data. And one postdoc is looking at experimental human footprints to talk about fossilized human footprints. And then also looking at stone tools as well. That's our main source of evidence, looking at ancient technology, how it was used, how it was made, how it spread across the landscape, what are the similarities and differences with similar technologies outside of India as well. So all of these things are multidisciplinary in nature. They use multiple methods and are integrated to look at a more comprehensive and holistic perspective of human evolution in different habitats, in different environments, and at different points in space and time. Thank you very much for your attention. And in case we don't cover all the questions today, you're free to email me, which is my address is at the bottom of this slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Parth, for this wonderful lecture, wonderful talk. Now I'll give it over to Anupam to conduct the question and answer session.
Thank you, Rukmini. Thank you, Professor Parth, for the very interesting talk. I'll move on to the questions now. So the first question is by Asif Muhammad. He's asking, how do you know which magnetization belongs to which age? That is, how do you calibrate magnetic orientation and time?
Okay, so that's a good question. So as I said, for paleomagnetic dating, we need lengthy sequences. If you have a sequence that is about 1 meter high or 5 meters high, and if you only have a reversal preserved in the section, then that's not enough. We need multiple polarity transitions, reversed polarity and normal polarity. So when we pinpoint all of these different transitions on the landscape, so we'll never get one single section from top to bottom. On a landscape, you're going to get different sections of different ages at different locations. And once we document them, we collect samples for paleomagnetic dating. And then what we do is we make something called a composite stratigraphy. And we put that together, and we get a very long sequence by putting all those sections together, and then looking at where the different polarity transitions are. And then we find the pattern, because in the past, there's a pattern of polarity transitions. Certain reverse polarities where the events were short, some were longer. So when we know the duration of these things, then we can pinpoint the ages of these things. But we need very lengthy sequences. And we can also use animal fossils that we find preserved in the layers to correlate with the transitions in the past.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Parth, for the answer. Next question is by Nazneen. She asks, does the impact of an asteroid play a role in the extinction of species? There have been asteroid impacts in the past. So,
yes. So the hypothesis, especially the most famous one, is for dinosaurs. But in archaeology, there have been records of impact craters on the landscape, but it's not clear how much of an impact they had at a large scale. Of course, they have major impacts at a regional level in small populations and associated resources on the landscape. But at a global level, we don't think they had major impacts. There were other factors involved that had probably bigger impacts. For example, volcanic eruptions or changes in temperature, for example. These would have had more major impacts than short-term impact of asteroids.
Thank you. Next, this question is by Dr. Parveen, and he says that most of the studies and images you discussed are from foreign. What is our status in India? What are the major challenges in this field?
So India, we have many sites available. The problem is that we have just started to tap into this evidence. We have a lot of expertise, we have a lot of labs, but the questions that have been asked in the West, we are just starting to ask those in the last few decades. So now with new methods available, new instruments available, we can actually pinpoint and target specific sites, specific collections in the museums or departments which were collected earlier. We can try to apply the same methods and see and compare the results with other areas. Now, the one thing that has hampered research in the last few decades is one thing is a lack of interest in prehistory and prehistoric archaeology or human evolution. Another thing is lack of funding, which is not the case anymore because now more funding is available, but I'm talking about the past. Why we don't have so much evidence of these scientific studies in India. And the third is lack of expertise. But in the last 5 years, 10 years, all of these things have changed. There's international collaborations, there's more funding available from the government of India, there's expertise available within India, there's very impressive labs now coming up for these studies that can be applied to archaeology. And there's also labs dedicated to archaeological sciences at different IITs and ICTS coming up.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. The next question is by Vikash. He asks, since the lifestyle of humans have changed drastically because of the advancement in science and communication techniques, are there still any similarities in the habits of early humans and modern humans? So early humans, he says 30 Ka. Actually, I had this question, this abbreviation Ka and Ma in your slides. Yeah, that is the question by Vikash. Yeah.
Okay, can you repeat that? What is the exact question? Similarities between modern populations and older populations?
Yes.
Okay, so I think what you're referring to is hunter-gatherer populations today. So we do have many hunter-gatherer populations across the world, and many of them often continue the prehistoric lifestyle. Of course, we have now modern technology coming in, and they're changing their lifestyle, they're adapting to new ways, but we still have many of them using prehistoric resources. So we still have stone tool use happening in Papua New Guinea, in parts of Africa, but of course it's rapidly changing, rapidly dying. We still have isolated hunter-gatherer groups living and being discovered in South America, in the jungles of South America. So there are isolated populations still living a Stone Age lifestyle, but I wouldn't say it's completely Stone Age. There's a combination of things. There's, for example, the hunting technique might be Stone Age, but it's combined with Neolithic farming in some places. It's combined with use of modern technology as well. So now there's an integration of different prehistoric periods and lifestyles in single locations.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I'll just mention he has pointed out a particular time, habits of early humans, 30 Ka, and modern humans, present days. So I think he's...
So 30 Ka is 30,000 years ago. So that is basically Homo sapiens was dominant that time. So it depends. It depends on what region you're talking about. The time frame is not the only important thing. For example, it's possible that people in parts of Africa 30,000 years ago and today in Africa, we're living a similar lifestyle, especially, for example, the Bushmen in Southern Africa. So those are hunter-gatherers. Then you have the Hadza in Eastern Africa. So we do have certain people still living the same lifestyle that they did 30,000 years ago. But I would say that this lifestyle goes beyond 30,000. It even goes back to 100,000, 200,000 years ago.
Thank you. Next question is by Shikha. She asks, how much ethno-archaeological studies are helpful in reconstruction of prehistoric society, that in the context of Indian subcontinent?
Okay, good question. Prehistoric research has a very lengthy history in India. We have the knowledge of stone tools from the late 1800s onwards, so over a century. But ethnoarchaeology has not been done that much compared to other regions in India. We have knowledge of different hunter-gatherer groups. We have knowledge of different pastoralist communities. We have knowledge of different farming communities. But I would say that ethnoarchaeology has been done very, very less comparatively. There's a lot of scope. On the one hand, there's a lot of scope for this research, but on the other hand, there's two challenges. One is that the lifestyle is changing rapidly. So there's a loss of traditional languages, traditional material culture, traditional habitats. All these things are changing rapidly. But the bigger problem or methodological issue, and this is at a global level, is that we cannot always fully rely on ethnoarchaeological observations to interpret the past, because we don't know what changes occurred in between. For example, if you're looking at an archaeological site that is 100,000 years old, and then looking at modern hunter-gatherers in the same area, we don't know what happened in between. In those 100,000 years, we don't know how many communities went through. We don't know how many technologies were used and abandoned. So there's a lot of chronological gaps and cultural gaps in between where we don't have any histories or records. So we cannot directly apply modern observations to past archaeological evidences, but we can use them as broad inferences to accurately, to better accurately interpret archaeological evidence, but not fully depend on it.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Parth. She has several questions, but I'll take one more question from her. Is that from India, we don't have much evidence of human fossil from Indian subcontinent, but we have modern human fossils from Sri Lankan caves. So how these modern concepts of nations are affecting our research approaches with special reference to prehistoric context?
At the moment, I would say the political boundaries are not affecting the research. It's more about interest. Sometimes the interest is there, but the funding is not there. Sometimes the funding is there, but the interest is not there. In most cases, and this is varies from country to country and continent to continent, in most cases, the projects are leaning towards younger time periods, because younger time periods has more material culture to actually capture the public's imagination. It's more appealing to the public, and that means it can lead to more funding, more museum exhibits, more exposure in the media, for example. So the prehistoric evidences have, except for the human fossils, have not received that much attention compared to younger time periods. And in India, we have a problem where a lot of the research, for example, is happening on Harappan sites, but not on the prehistoric sites. And that is ironic because the cultural roots of the Harappans are actually found in the prehistoric populations. So we have definitely a vacuum in prehistoric archaeology across the region. And the one reason for this is, of course, the lack of fossils. But I would say that there's a kind of an inverse problem. On the one hand, it's like a circular argument. On the one hand, prehistory is not popular in India because we don't find that many fossils compared to African sites or Chinese sites or European sites. But on the other hand, I would also say that we haven't found that many exciting sites because we haven't looked. We haven't looked systematically. We don't have that many experts in human fossils in India yet. So even if archaeologists found human fossils, they would not recognize them. So there's many problems at various levels for explaining the lack of human fossils in India. Now, the fact that they're found in Sri Lankan caves is because they're found in caves. They're better preserved inside the caves, the burials. But in India, we don't have deep caves. We don't have that many tropical rainforests with caves in India. So we need to find sites more strategically. We need to find sediments and context using modern technology like GIS, remote sensing, stratigraphy, geology, all of these various disciplines, and pinpoint locations where we might find human fossils. And of course, we have to appreciate also the limitations of India. We should not expect to have the same records as we're finding in other parts of the old world. We should respect the uniqueness of the region. We should respect the limitations and work accordingly.
Thank you, Professor, for the answer. Next question is by Ramani. He asked, what about understanding continental drift in understanding our past? So I think he's asking, how does the information about continental drift helps us in understanding our past?
We normally don't look at continental drift in that way because there's a huge difference in time. There's a huge gap. Continental drift is way far back in time, and huge time gap between those events and the appearance of humans. So there's no relationship or impact on human populations from continental drift. But I would say that if you look at other aspects at that scale, for example, fluctuations in sea level, or change in monsoon patterns across continents from Africa to Southeast Asia, or looking at wind directions, or change in precipitation or humidity. These are the factors that would have affected human populations in the past, not continental drift per se.
Thank you, Professor. Next question is by Anukul Das. He asked, what are the process of calculating age of something with carbon radiation? So how do we calculate age by carbon radiation of a particular thing? This is the question.
Okay, so if you have organic material, it could be bone, for example, or wood. So in the past, and even today, the same processes were acting on these different environments and landscapes and objects. So the concept behind radiocarbon dating is looking at the amount of carbon. And because carbon decays at a specific rate, it has a half-life of about 5,300 years. Because of that rate, that fixed rate of decay, we can calculate how much carbon, based on the amount of carbon found in the artifact or in the object, we can extrapolate and hypothesize how much carbon would have been there at the time of deposition. Now, keeping in mind that, first of all, that the object has organic material preserved, there's carbon present. Second, that it is younger than 50,000. And third, that there's no contamination. All of these factors are required to understand that age very accurately. It's possible that it went through multiple cycles of exposure and burial, and then it came from an older context and got buried in a younger context. So context or contextual integrity really matters a lot when you're trying to date these things.
Thank you, Professor. Next question is by Badrinath, and he asks, India is a country with different cultures and many have ruled. Does this make the archaeological study a bit complex? And its extension is, or is there any scale to study?
Yes. So as I've emphasized in my presentation, every region across the world, and also every region within India, has its own record. It has its own preservational integrity. Some records are missing, some records are very well preserved. So we need to look at archaeology from a regional perspective. Now, when I say regional perspective, I mean that in several levels. One is geographically. We should understand even microgeographically. We should understand that different pockets, even for example, within the Thar Desert, there were multiple cultures in the past, not just one culture. and then looking at the Himalaya, for example, a similar, broadly a similar habitat from Pakistan to Northeast India. But even within that entire range of mountains, we have different cultures emerging. So the cultural diversity needs to be dealt with from a regional perspective, from a chronological perspective, and from an individual perspective. And we should be very careful not to use interpretations from one culture in one region to apply it to another region. Just because something happened in one manner in area A doesn't mean that those ideas in those material cultures spread to other areas, even if the other areas are in close proximity, geographic proximity. So we need to understand and appreciate and respect the limitations that we have for each region, and also the nature of the records, and also the diversity of the culture in that area. In some cases, we might get very high diversity. In other cases, it might be just one culture and no change over time.
Thank you, Professor. So I think I also enjoyed the part where you showed reconstructing experiments. That was really interesting. So Harshita has a different question, but she asks, can we try to bring back the ostrich who have disappeared to the current India and try to see the changes which led to their disappearance here? I think the broader question is, can we simulate and figure out things, what happened in the past?
That's an interesting question. Now, people might be knowing about this from the media and everything, that there's also talk about, for example, shifting some lions from Gujarat to Madhya Pradesh. There's also been talk about bringing back the cheetah. The cheetah used to be widespread in India and then became extinct. Bringing back the cheetah, reintroducing cheetah populations by getting some populations from Central Asia or from Iran, and then introducing them to India. Now, one problem with this possibility or this idea is that the current situation is vastly different from past. And I mean that at different levels. The human population is very high. There's not enough habitat for these species, including the ostrich. And most importantly, the climatic signatures that we find today are vastly different from they were in the past. So whatever happens to these animals today will not be the same thing that happened in the past. So it's, in a way, I understand what you're saying, that to recreate an experiment to hypothesize about the past by recreating the conditions in the present, but it's not possible. It's very challenging. There's many hindrances, there's many limitations, and there's many methodological problems with that, and maybe even ethical issues involved. Some people scientists are even talking about bringing back mammoths, bringing back hominins like Neanderthals, because we have DNA, but it's not ethically viable. It's not scientifically feasible always, and all the limitations and challenges also kind of suggest that the results that you would get, the interpretations that you would find, the observations that you would make, would not be readily applicable to what you're finding at archaeological sites.
Thank you for the explanation, Professor. Next question is by, we have just 10 more minutes left. Next question is by Surya Prakash, and he asked, was there any change observed in the farming types from region to region, depending on climate change over the time in the past?
Yes, we get many. I'm assuming that the person is asking at a global level, even at an Indian level. The fossil records, first of all, we have to remember that, again, preservation issues. So there's preservation bias at many places. Not all these fossils we find today, the animal fossils we find today, represent the entire record from the past. But based on well-preserved sites and well-preserved regions, we can broadly say that there are climatic impacts on certain species, whether they're large mammals or reptiles or birds. We have global records that indicate impact of climate, impact of ecology, and environmental change on these populations. And we also find evidence of migrations. We find evidence of speciations, extinctions. But what we're just trying to do is, in regions like India, we're just trying to fill those gaps. We have major gaps in our knowledge. We have a lot of evidences from East Africa, from Europe, from South Africa, but we don't have enough information from India or Central Asia or Eastern Asia, for example. Southeast Asia is also unknown. So we need to understand, again, the preservation bias and respect that, and also factor in the missing records.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Next question is by Tarun. He asks, how can we figure out what was there in the current deserts?
You mean ecologically, I guess? I'm assuming.
Well, he has not explicitly explained. He just asked, how can we figure out what was there in the current deserts? Yeah, that's the.
There's a lot of projects going on in deserts, in fact, in India, in Arabia, in Africa. And one thing is for sure that there were not always deserts. We have evidences of human occupation. We have animal fossils. We have sedimentary evidences of ancient rivers, ancient lakes, ancient forests. So the deserts that we see today were not always deserts in the past. But at the same time, we do get evidences also of human populations, animal populations adapting to desert environments once deserts started forming. So we have evidences, for example, in Thar Desert, almost 20-meter dune sequences. We have archaeological layers across the entire dune. So the dunes have been dated to going back to 200,000 years old near the Dwana. And some of these dunes show lower Paleolithic evidence, middle Paleolithic evidence, upper Paleolithic evidence, and Mesolithic evidence. And that shows adaptation to arid environments. So we definitely have presence of humans, presence of animals before the deserts existed and during the process of desertification.
Okay, thank you. Next question is by Sarvesh. He has two questions actually. Are river and seabeds also covered in archaeological explorations? And next question is, we used to hear about explorations for mythological Dwarka in seabed of Gujarat coast. Your comment.
The first question, scientists are actually looking at ocean floors and the sediments as well. And we're regularly finding archaeological evidences, especially because the sea level fluctuations have submerged many sites across the world. But not just historical sites or proto-historic sites, just 5,000 years old, for example, but also in England, for example, or surrounding areas in Europe, they're getting human fossils on the seafloor. That means these areas were once land bridges. They were exposed. They were being used as corridors of human movement, and they're finding stone tools and many things. Now, a riverbed is different from seafloor or lake floor. A riverbed is very active. The river channel is very active. It would normally not preserve archaeological evidences unless they got deeply buried first and then the river started flowing. So it makes a difference in the type of context you find these things in. And about Dwarka, there has been media articles and a lot of things on TV about ancient structures found in Dwarka, submerged cities, for example. Now, submerged cities or submerged towns, they're very common because eventually what's going to happen over time, ancient cities were submerged by rising sea levels and floods. But we don't know the ages of these things. Some say they're 30,000 years old, some say they're 20,000 years old, but they've not been properly scientifically proven to be that old. They're probably much, much younger. In fact, these structures are probably younger than 5,000 or 4,000 years old, more closer to 2,000, 1,000. So we should not go by only media reports. We should go by long-term scientific studies to prove this. And one more thing that is required in this kind of discipline like archaeology is consistency. We need more evidences, not just one site or one artifact. We need 10 sites or a dozen sites or 24 sites to show that there was consistently contemporary evidences in that context.
Thank you. So this will be the second last question for the session. Tarun asked, can we figure out when did the river dry using archaeology? And I'll add to that question, there's another question like, can we figure out information about water table, the water beneath the ground, and how it has influenced culture? Were they digging, or, you know? So yeah, it's about water, the question.
Okay. The first question, yes, we can, if we have again, a pristine landscape with excavations at well-preserved sites, multiple sites are investigated, we map the landscape, we look at the stratigraphy of the landscape, we build up a story of how the landscape changed over time, where the river used to flow, and where it flows now. If you can identify the locations where the river used to flood, like for example, the main channel area versus the floodplain zone versus the location of different sites. And if we get ages or dates from these sites, over time, we would build up a geographic or spatial reconstruction of that area. For example, the earliest evidences were near this ancient channel, and the younger evidences were shifted to a different ancient channel over time. So once we have a series of dates, multiple sites, and landscape reconstruction, including the rivers, the terrestrial zones, everything, then we can say exactly where the channels were getting dry and where the population were moving. Even in prehistoric sites, we have evidences of hominins using the landscape according to lakeshore fluctuations. Every time the lake receded or it expanded, for example, we would have hominin populations following that lakeshore. If the lake contracted or shrank because of the drought or a dry season, we have hominins going closer to the shore. So we get evidences of hominin occupation or archaeological occupation according to lakeshore environments, riverine context, various water sources. And the second question, yes, we do have evidences of long-term use of a specific location because of water. We have, for example, at Harappan sites or at historical sites, the constant use of one location or one well because of supplied water. In fact, at some Harappan sites, we have evidences of the well being stacked and the same well being used over many generations, over hundreds of years, sometimes over thousands of years, because that well continued to supply water because the water table was stable. Now, there might be evidences where the water table was low, but the population continued to thrive because they stored water in tanks, for example. So we do have evidences of adaptations to fluctuating water sources at different sites, but not all sites.
Thank you, Professor, for the question. The answers. I have one last question for you. I just want a general, what do you think has been a very interesting tool that you have discovered in your research, which you would like to share with us? I mean, I'm very interested how these tools have been evolving and what kind of impact it had on, how they were collecting food or their culture. If you could just tell us a little bit more. I mean, I wanted to know about that.
Sure. So the most, I would say, compelling or exciting artifacts that we find that archaeologists are obsessed with are hand axes. They're pointed artifacts, they're large, and they look symmetrical. And I would say that in a way, it's very intriguing because hand axes, or bifaces, you can say, from a more general sense, because they have two faces, they never stop being made. From the Stone Age, they started being made around 1.8 million years ago, and then they were evolving and becoming smaller. And by 500,000 years ago, they became small, and they started being put on spears to make spear points. And then they became even smaller to make arrowheads to use with bows and arrows. So this technology of bifaces and pointed artifacts lasting from 1.8 million until modern times. And I'm not talking about modern times only in archaeological sense or behavioral sense. I'm talking about from a research perspective as well. Archaeologists replicate this artifact all over the world to understand its manufacturing technique, its efficiency, also to understand cognitive processes behind that artifact. So when we find hand axes in the field, it's very, very exciting. Another very exciting artifact type, I would say, is microliths. Now, what is interesting about microliths is that I would just give an example that normally microliths come after the Paleolithic phase. They become very small and they're about this large. Average size is about 2 centimeters, 3 centimeters long, and they're used as composite artifacts. But when we look at them from individual site perspectives, they give new meaning. So one site we're working in Konkan called Kuriosity. What is intriguing is a small cave site. We don't know the age yet. We're still working that out. But for the first time, we're finding that there's Paleolithic type artifacts made on a specific rock type called quartzite, and there's microlithic artifacts made on quartz. So normally, you will always get Paleolithic artifacts at one location in the sequence, and then microlithic artifacts at a higher location or younger location in the sequence. But at this site, we're getting both objects together. So it seems that they had a very unique adaptation for a very unique environment. So I would say these kind of artifacts, and of course rock paintings as well. These kind of tools, these kind of artifacts and evidences are very exciting when we find them in the field.
Great, great. Thank you so much for the answers, Professor Parth. Now I'll hand over to Rukmini for the closing.
Yeah,
thank
you very much. Thanks everyone for your questions, and especially Parth for the very interesting discussion. I would like to thank the outreach team and the AV team for this hosting this event so nicely. So thank you all. Good evening to you all.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you to the audience for listening. And I also enjoyed the question session.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Welcome.
Bye.
Bye.